The topic of memory with a capital M is a distinct and separate and unique field of academic study in its own right. It's not really an attempt to try to ascertain exactly what happened at that time. It's much more different attempts to understand how that has come to be understood, received, reorganized, reworked, reordered, consumed as legacies or as influences. And it is sometimes singular and sometimes plural. Owning history, memory, and the fall of Singapore during World War II. It's a very good gateway into the general wider topic of memory as a theme or a field of study in history per se, because conflict is one of the touchstones that runs throughout the human experience, across the globe and down the long span of time. One of the reasons why memory has become such a dynamic and thriving field of study in history is because it allows us to draw so many connections across different things, across themes, across times, even across fields of study. And Singapore is no exception. But I'm more interested in initiating a conversation using this topic about the wider theme of memory in history per se, and about the Singaporean connection and engagement with memory in history per se, using, of course, one of those great iconic moments in Singapore history. We all lived through another one. I was standing on Red Hill, right around the corner from where I lived, when the funeral procession for Mr. Lee Kuan Yew went all the long way from Parliament all the way to our Kent Ridge campus. And it was pouring rain, and I was standing in a crowd 10 deep all the way along the road. And everybody there knew that they were part of a memory and history moment as well. And very recently, World War II at Bukit Brown, supported by the Singapore Heritage Society, a collection of personal memories edited by Claire Liao and Catherine Lim, which really concentrates much more strongly on individual memories of what has become in recent years one of the more fascinating expressions of what I guess I should call grassroots engagement with history and war memory in Singapore. Provoked, of course, if that's the right word to use, by the government decision to expropriate much of the Bukit Brown cemetery area in order to build roadways. But what's most interesting from our point of view here is that this was a long, open, and really very vigorous process in terms of discussion and exchange involving more than one stakeholding group, including this time a vigorous civil society participation. So there are signs of good, robust health in terms of engagement with memory, particularly war memory in Singapore, and it does seem to be at least one of those themes where not everything is left entirely up to the state. There's the context of the battle for Singapore and the Japanese occupation. This is so important. I must have interviewed in the course of working on studies that led to books and articles about the battle for Singapore and the Malayan campaign, more than 100 British, Australian, and local veterans who fought in the campaign in one capacity or another. By the time I got into it in the 1990s, the senior people had all passed away, so these were middle-ranking or junior people. Nearly every single one of them said, in answer to a question I asked, if they had known what would happen to them as prisoners of war, they would not have surrendered, they would have fought much harder. Why not? Because if they were going to go through hell anyway, why not fight it out to the finish? That may have been bravado, but the whole question of how the battle for Singapore is remembered, and it only took 2 weeks, only 8 days of fighting on the island itself, is really overwhelmingly overshadowed by the much longer period of occupation that followed because of how difficult that long period was for so many people. And in the case of the Australians and the British, they've never really recovered from this. So certainly, the context is all important. What happened after the battle very much colors memories of the battle itself. I left out deliberately, and I shouldn't have done that, the Japanese, who are in a similar situation. They too have no great connection with or engagement with war memory in Malaya and Singapore. And it's not necessarily because of any sense of shame or remorse about their behavior here. It's because other more important things in their eyes happened to them. The war in China and the war against the United States, particularly the US Navy, was far more significant to Japan as a whole, and Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the bombing of Tokyo rather occupy all the attention. One of the first things that I always say when I'm giving a talk on what the Japanese occupation years were like in Singapore from the point of view of a professional historian who has done his best to research the topic and who didn't live here at the time, one of the first things I say is, statistically, it was better to be here than in most other cities in Southeast Asia. Certainly, for example, Manila, which was completely destroyed in the fighting, so you had a higher chance to survive. But it was better still to live on a farm in a remote part of Malaya or Thailand because you had a still better chance to survive. And the records show, the memories indicate, that it wasn't a case of living in absolute fear of your life every single day for 3.5 years. There were ordinary days. But it also shows that there were bad times. But before then, of course, the Japanese were much harder on the Chinese in general as a whole than on the other communities in Singapore for their own reasons. They had their own agenda. Now, rather than suppress that fact, it has been embedded into the engagement with national memory during this period. The right move. Swim with the evidence. And memories do get transmitted. Yes, they do. They do pass through the generations. But along the way, of course, they get reflected and refracted. One of the things that has challenged and troubled historians of memory is Shakespeare's old warning that old men forget. But historians have always taken that to be a warning that when you must compare a document written at the time with a memory of the event many, many years later, you need to be very careful about assuming the memory is more accurate than the document. Now, you don't take either at face value, but you need to be very, very careful about it. Right? Generations and the passage of time, that does matter. There are also lieux de mémoire, a French phrase for places at which something of significance happened, and that can often be crowned, capstoned, or brought out by memorials and monuments. This is one such example. This is, of course, Changi Beach, and this is the National Heritage Board plaque put up in 1995 to commemorate one of the Sukching massacres that occurred here in February 1942. And you're all familiar with this policy, and we all know why the Japanese did this. They took these men to remote, out-of-the-way places of Singapore where nobody could see what they did, not because they were ashamed of what they were doing, but because they wanted to intimidate the families of these men into behaving themselves and being quiet. If you take the menfolk and you kill them in front of their families, you're going to enrage a lot of them, and you're going to make them your enemies, and they're going to dedicate their lives to getting revenge against you. If you take them and you disappear them, then you have an awful lot of people in that community saying, he might come home if you just behave yourself, because of the power of hope in the human heart. So this is a lieu de mémoire memorialized by a monument, and this is one of those indications where I think the state gets it right. That's a memory connecting with heritage. In Hong Kong, the Japanese actually did go through Hong Kong like a knife through butter as well. They did not organize a systematic roundup, but the main reason is because they'd been in Hong Kong through their espionage apparatus for an awful lot longer in much greater strength. They'd been in a strong military presence across the border for more than a year and a half, and they were in South China in great strength. And they had also cut a deal with the triads, frankly, who handed large sections of Hong Kong over to them without a shot in return for the Japanese agreeing not to go too hard on the people who lived there. And yet many Hong Kong civilians did fall victim to the Japanese, particularly those who were on Japanese hit lists, which especially involved communists who were believed to be irreconcilable enemies. But although the Hong Kong circumstances were a little different, it's only because the circumstances at that time and place were a little different. In China, they also behaved commensurately if they felt the need to do so. If you don't mind, I'll just focus on the guns. The question of could they have done anything different overall is a pretty big one. But one of the fascinating things to professional historians is how strongly perceptions of certain historical truths get embedded. People will still say, from all kinds of different vantage points, the guns were pointing the wrong way, and that's one reason why Singapore fell to the Japanese. But what the record shows is that it was a little bit more complicated than that. So several points to make. First, The investment on the guns was designed to force the Japanese to make a certain commitment if they were going to take Singapore, to force them to come in great strength, which means that it would require them to run risks everywhere else because they were concentrating so much on taking Singapore, and they could be seen coming a long way off. So it couldn't be taken by a quick opportunistic snatch and grab by a small force. So from that point of view, the investment on the guns actually worked. The problem is that events elsewhere undid this.